Welcome to the Deep Dive. You're here because you want to get smart, fast on stuff that matters, and maybe even have a few of those aha moments along the way, without getting buried under a mountain of jargon. Today, we're doing exactly that with a potentially surprising difference between the electromagnetic fields all around us in nature and the ones created by our gadgets.
That's right. We're plunging into the fascinating world of polarization and its role in how electromagnetic fields, or EMFs, and electromagnetic radiation, EMR, interact with living things. You shared some compelling material with us, excerpts from a scientific paper called Polarization. A key difference between man-made and natural electromagnetic fields in regard to biological activity, along with your own notes. These sources offer a really intriguing scientific perspective on why the EMFs we create might have, well, different effects on us than the natural EMFs that have always been part of our environment.
Okay, so here's the head scratcher that immediately grabbed me.
Right.
Why is it that the incredibly weak electromagnetic radiation coming from your mobile phones sometimes raises eyebrows, while the unbelievably powerful radiation from the sun is absolutely essential for all life on Earth? It just doesn't seem to add up, does it?
It really doesn't, and that's the central mystery we're going to unravel in this deep dive. Our sources point to a fundamental difference. Man-made EMFs are generally polarized, whereas natural EMFs, think sunlight, the Earth's magnetic field, even the warmth radiating from your own body, are typically not.
Polarization. Okay, in simple terms, what are we actually talking about here? Like, what is it?
Okay, imagine an electromagnetic wave as a tiny vibrating arrow moving through space. Polarization basically tells you the direction in which that arrow is wiggling. If it is linearly polarized, that arrow is shaking back and forth in a single straight line. Think of shaking a jump rope up and down. The wave you see is polarized in that up and down direction. Now, picture unpolarized waves as a whole bunch of those vibrating arrows, but each one is shaking in a random direction, constantly changing. Natural EMFs are like this big mix of randomly wiggling arrows.
Okay.
Now, sometimes you can have combinations of those linear vibrations that create more complex patterns, like a spiral that's called circular polarization or elliptical.
Got it. So natural EMFs are this chaotic buzz of vibrations going every which way, while man-made EMFs have a more organized directional vibe to them. Where does this fundamental difference come from?
That's a crucial question. Natural EMFs are born out of countless random events happening at the tiniest levels in molecules, atoms, even within the nucleus of an atom. When an excited atom, for instance, loses some energy, it spits out a tiny packet of electromagnetic energy called a photon. And the direction of its vibration, its polarization, is pretty much random. Because you have trillions upon trillions of these random emissions happening all the time from natural sources, the overall electromagnetic field ends up being this unpolarized jumble. Think of the light from a campfire. It's coming from countless glowing embers, each emitting light in its own haphazard way.
Okay, that paints a clear picture for natural EMFs. What about the ones we create? How do they get their organized vibration, our technology?
Man-made EMFs, on the other hand, are usually produced by electrons being forced to move back and forth in a very specific direction within an electrical circuit, like inside an antenna. Because these electrons are being pushed and pulled along a defined path, the electromagnetic waves they generate inherit that organized motion and become polarized, usually linearly.
Okay.
The radio waves shooting out from a broadcast antenna are a perfect example. The way the antenna is built dictates the direction of that organized vibration. Interestingly, as our sources point out, around some high-voltage power lines that use a three-phase system, you can actually find circularly or elliptically polarized EMFs at those low-power frequencies of 50 or 60 hertz.
All right, so the key difference is nature equals random vibrations. We call that unpolarized. Technology equals organized vibrations. We call that polarized. Now, here's the million-dollar question. How does this organized vibration actually boost the biological activity of these man-made EMFs? What's the connection to our bodies?
According to the study, there are two main ways that polarization gives man-made EMFs a leg up in terms of biological activity. The first is their ability to create something called constructive interference. When you have polarized waves coming from multiple sources, like several cell phone towers, they're all vibrating in the same direction, they have the same polarization, these waves can line up in certain spots and reinforce each other.
Constructive interference, that's where the peaks of one wave add to the peaks of another, making a much bigger wave, right? So you get these localized zones of super strength radiation, these hot spots.
Exactly. This amplification can lead to specific areas having a much higher intensity of electromagnetic energy than you'd expect from just one source alone, creating these hotspots. Our source emphasizes that because natural EMFs are a mishmash of polarizations, they generally don't line up in this way to create such strong interference patterns under everyday circumstances, except maybe in very controlled lab experiments.
So these hotspots of amplified organized radiation are one way man-made EMFs can be more biologically active. What's the second way polarization makes a difference?
The second key mechanism is the ability of polarized EMFs to induce what are called forced oscillations in our biological tissues. Because they have that consistent organized vibration, polarized EMFs can essentially force charged or polar molecules within and around our living cells, and especially those crucial free ions that do so much for cell signaling and function, to also vibrate in parallel lines and in sync with the incoming field.
Okay, I can picture that like a marching band all stepping in the same rhythm. But why is that synchronized movement a bigger deal for our biology compared to the random jiggling from unpolarized EMFs?
Well, think about it this way. Unpolarized EMFs, with their electric fields all pointing in different directions at any given moment, they can't really create that kind of coordinated net oscillation in charged particles. Instead, they mostly just cause a general random jiggling of molecules, which primarily leads to the generation of heat. It's like shaking a container of sand, all the grains move, but there's no organized flow, right?
Right, heat is a general bulk effect. So these forced directional oscillations, how can they actually mess with how our cells work?
Our source dives into this by focusing on these tiny gates in our cell membranes called electrosensitive ion channels. These channels are like microscopic turnstiles that control the flow of charged particles, ions, in and out of our cells, and they open and close based on the electrical forces acting on their built-in sensors.
And these sensors are really sensitive to the electrical landscape across the cell membrane, right? The voltage.
Precisely. Now, the theory is that the synchronized movement of ions near these channels caused by a polarized EMF can exert a kind of cumulative electrical pressure on these voltage sensors. Imagine having a bunch of tiny fingers all pushing on the same switch at the same time. Even if the external EMF is much weaker than the natural electrical fields within the cell membrane, this sort of amplified push by the oscillating ions can potentially cause these channels to open or close at the wrong times.
So a relatively weak external signal, made stronger by the synchronized movement of these charged particles, can throw off the delicate balance of these crucial ion channels. That's the idea.
Exactly. And the potential ripple effects of this irregular gatekeeping are significant. The study mentions things like altered production rates of important biological molecules, damage to DNA and proteins, and potentially even leading to cell death, reproductive problems, or the development of cancer, which is why the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IRRC, has classified low-frequency magnetic fields and radiofrequency EMFs as possibly carcinogenic. What's particularly noteworthy is that many of the studies showing these negative effects involved radiation intensities that were actually much lower than what we typically experience from natural EMFs.
That really circles us back to the original puzzle. Seemingly weak phone radiation versus powerful sunlight. So, let's get down to brass tacks. What kind of electromagnetic field strengths are we talking about that this study flags as potentially problematic? Give us some real-world numbers.
Okay, the study provides some specific examples. For the EMFs associated with our power grids, that's the 50 or 60 hertz fields from power lines, they point to intensities exceeding 5 millivolts per meter as potentially disruptive. Yeah, and they also highlight that if you have multiple power lines running parallel to each other, the polarized fields they generate could constructively interfere, creating even higher local field strengths.
Okay, 5 millivolt. That doesn't sound like a huge amount of energy, though.
It's not, but the studies suggest it can be enough to interfere with those sensitive ion channels under the right, prolonged exposure conditions. Then they look at the pulsed EMFs, which are characteristic of how digital mobile phones transmit information. Here, the estimated thresholds for potential disruption are even lower.
Lower? How much lower?
They specifically mention pulse repetition frequencies of 217 hertz and 8.34 hertz, and the corresponding electric field intensity thresholds are a mere 0.01 volts per meter and an incredibly tiny 0.00004 volts per meter, respectively.
Wow, 0.00004 VMM. That's practically nothing. Really nothing.
It is, and the study points out that these sorts of intensities can be found at certain distances from both cell phones themselves and cellular base stations. They also bring up an important point about magnetic fields, like those emitted by cell phones. These oscillating magnetic fields can actually induce electric fields within our bodies.
Ah, right.
As a striking example, they mentioned that a 1 Gauss low-frequency magnetic field oscillating at 217 hertz, which is within the range measured near cell phones, can induce an electric field of around zero point 0.1 volts per meter inside the body, significantly higher than that 0.01 VMever threshold they just mentioned.
So it's not just the external electromagnetic field strength we need to consider, but also the electric fields that these magnetic fields can generate within us. That adds a whole new layer of complexity to thinking about this.
Absolutely. It really underscores how these man-made EMFs, with their specific polarized nature and their pulsing characteristics, can interact with our biology in ways that might seem disproportionate to their overall energy output compared to natural sources.
This all leads to a pretty fundamental question. If the natural EMFs we're constantly surrounded by are so much stronger in many cases, why aren't we seeing similar widespread biological disruptions? We've evolved under the sun, after all, which blasts us with EMFs.
And that's a critical point that the study directly addresses. Life on Earth has indeed always been bathed in natural EMFs. However, as we've discussed, the crucial difference is that these natural fields are generally unpolarized.
Right.
Although natural light can become somewhat polarized through processes like scattering in the atmosphere or reflection off surfaces, the key is that living organisms have had vast stretches of evolutionary time to adapt to these long-standing unpolarized fields and their natural variations.
So it's a matter of our evolutionary history. Our biological systems have learned how to deal with the random, unorganized electromagnetic noise of nature.
Essentially, yes. Now contrast that with the relatively recent, in evolutionary terms, just a few generations, an incredibly widespread introduction of distinctly polarized man-made EMFs. The argument here is that our biological systems simply haven't had the evolutionary time to fully develop effective ways to adapt to this fundamentally different type of electromagnetic exposure, even if the overall intensities are sometimes lower than natural sources. It's a novel kind of signal that our cells haven't yet learned to properly interpret or effectively counteract.
That makes a lot of intuitive sense. It's like introducing a completely new type of molecule into the environment, even in small concentrations. It could have unexpected effects because organisms haven't evolved defenses against it.
That's a very apt analogy. And the study does point out that in some very specific medical applications, carefully controlled polarized static or pulsed magnetic fields can actually be beneficial,
Oh, interesting.
highlighting that the interaction of polarized EMFs with biology isn't inherently negative. It really emphasizes the nuanced and complex nature of these interactions. It's not just black and white.
So what's the core message here? What should someone listening to this deep dive really take away about the difference between natural and man-made EMFs?
The main takeaway, really, is that polarization appears to be a crucial factor that distinguishes how man-made and natural EMFs interact with our biology. This difference in polarization could be a key reason why the EMFs we create can sometimes have biological effects at much lower overall intensities compared to the EMFs that have always been present in our natural environment.
Okay.
The study acknowledges that just because we see increased biological activity doesn't automatically translate to observable negative health outcomes, because our bodies do have various adaptive mechanisms. However, these protective mechanisms might be less effective when we're under stress or when we experience prolonged exposure to these fundamentally different polarized EMFs.
And the study itself points towards where future scientific investigation needs to focus to better understand all of this, right? To really nail it down.
Absolutely. The authors call for more direct research that specifically compares the biological effects of polarized and unpolarized EMFs that are otherwise identical in their fundamental characteristics, like their frequency and overall intensity. This kind of focused research is essential to further validate these theoretical insights and give us a much deeper and more comprehensive understanding of the various bioeffects of electromagnetic fields.
Okay, this has been a truly eye-opening deep dive. It's remarkable to think that this seemingly simple property of polarization, the direction of the electromagnetic vibration, could hold such a vital key to understanding how our increasingly technological world interacts with our own biology in ways that are fundamentally different from the natural world we've always known.
Indeed. And it leaves us with a significant question for you, the listener, as you navigate your daily life surrounded by technology. What are the potential implications of this fundamental difference in polarization? What new questions did this raise for you about the safety and long-term consequences of our ever more wireless existence?
Yeah.
We encourage you to delve further into this fascinating area, perhaps by looking up the scientific study we've discussed, or exploring the concepts of electromagnetic polarization and its biological effects in more detail. It's an invitation to continue learning and thinking critically about the invisible world of electromagnetic fields that increasingly shapes our lives.